Hi, Chris Brown from Conservation Hackers here. Today I'm in Vancouver talking to Colette Wabnitz from the Centre for Ocean Solutions, Stanford University, and the Institute of Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia. And we're down on the waterfront having a chat about small-scale fisheries and the use and misuse of global data in their management.
Hi, I'm Colette Wabnitz and I work for the Stanford Centre for Ocean Solutions and the Institute of Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia.
I want to talk a bit about the risk assessment you've been doing for global fisheries and high seas fisheries.
Yes, so what we're very interested in is to have a greater understanding of the risk of illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, as well as labour abuse on high seas fisheries. And for that we combined two separate data sets. One data set was expert driven, so we distributed a worldwide survey where we asked people what they thought was the risk associated with IUU fishing and labour abuse at port in particular.
Mm-hmm. And just for everyone, IUU fishing is the illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. Yeah.
And so that was expert driven, so we distributed to people on the ground, so they could be working for academia or NGOs or with governments. For instance, and then we combine that with Global Fishing Watch data, so GFW data, which is looking at the actual tracks of vessels that they're derived from satellite data. And by combining these two data sets, we could identify areas that were particularly high risk of either IUU, so illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, or labor abuse. Yep. And there were several interesting things about this analysis. So one is that it was a global analysis, and we then had global findings to get a better understanding of where the high risks were. And in a lot of instances, the risks were coupled. So the risks of labor abuse and IUU were really coupled, but there are also some regions that emerged as more risky for IUU or more at risk for labor abuse. So that has interesting implications. It was also interesting because we combined these two data sets, which was kind of fun and different. And then a particularly exciting dimension was that we were able to then work with particularly the fishing industry, so an initiative called Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship, or CBOS for short. And by working with them, we sort of talked to them about where these high-risk areas were, and we're trying to get a better understanding of where their operations are most active, so that we can then identify where they might be most exposed to risk and what might be some steps that they want to take to mitigate their risk. So even if they operate in an area that is high risk, it doesn't mean that they have like a high risk in their fishery, but they might want to take more actions to sort of look into what is happening there. How can I mitigate my risk and make sure that I do not have any IUU or labor abuse in my fishery.
So in terms of the companies, what sorts of actions might they take if they identify, we have part of our fleets operating in a high risk area?
So they might just do the greater due diligence in their sort of like accounting or in their data. So just to look a bit more into, okay, so what ports do we actually utilize in those areas? What are some of the fleets that we have entering those countries? So one of the things that we looked at when we're doing the risk assessment is what might be some risk drivers. And so what we found is that flag of the fleet, so what flags the vessels fly, is a high risk.
The flag means like the country,
the country,
right?
Exactly, yeah. And then what gear type. So that already is helpful in terms of identifying how much of a risk you have, even if you land at a high risk port. If you know the flag of your vessel and the gear of your vessel, then you have a better understanding of your risk.
We're talking a bit about how this global data can be very useful for identifying broad priorities for management. But then you're also talking about there's a lot of risks if that's turned into very top-down management. So did you want to talk about some of the ways that you need to engage with local communities when implementing actions on the ground?
Regional Fisheries Management Organization, there might be some recommendations I may take forward. But in the case of like that top-down management can be limited as well. So I think one of the things that we're talking about is particularly for small-scale fisheries, which was quite different, and where you have like a lot of variety across the world of what small-scale fisheries do, how they operate. They tie into traditions and culture, which again is quite different across the world. And so I think it can be quite dangerous to some extent to have only top-down management, or to really only rely on top-down management for change or transformation. I think a lot of the ideas and the needs and the priorities need to be identified from the bottom up. So some of the examples that came to mind were So in Eastern Africa, for instance, there are quite a lot of small-scale fisheries that are really important to support both livelihoods in terms of revenue generation, but also nutrition and food security. And obviously, to sort of ensure sustainability of those fisheries over the long term, people are keen to implement various management strategies or conservation measures, and one of them is protected areas. And so there's been quite a few instances where these protected areas have been implemented from the top down, either through NGOs or governments. And they have good intentions at heart, but they haven't been driven by, in terms of siting, by the communities. Or if the communities have been part of the decision process, they might have only focused, for instance, on involving fishers, as in men fishers, and not necessarily women fishers. And women fishers often utilize other areas, and so they need to be involved in the discussion as well, so that you have like true equity in the conservation measures that are implemented, or management measures that are implemented.
Yeah, and so some of the unintended consequences you were talking about was where the marine protected area its placement has been driven by consultation with male fishers, but then the women are actually locked out of the important fishing area and have to travel further, or have to try to travel to places they might have permission to travel to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it's really important to engage all stakeholders and identify all stakeholders first, and then engage them when you're making those sorts of decisions.
Yeah.
And now one of the and so essentially it's I think the scale, like if you were to utilize a solution at a large scale, it would be that it's really important to involve all stakeholders when you make decisions. I think that can be something that is applied everywhere. But how you do that, who you need to involve, so who the stakeholders are, might vary across the board. So like in different countries, it might be very different. So it's a matter of like, having top down versus bottom up, but also what those bottom up approaches might be, or even what some of the top down approaches might be, will be quite different across the board. And so I quite like the sort of saying that it's like think global, but act local.
Hey there, you're listening to Conservation Hackers with Dr. Chris Brown, and we're talking to Colette Wabnitz on the Vancouver waterfront.
To work for SPC, which is the Pacific Community, and you were going around and talking with a lot of fisheries stakeholders there, and they were feeling quite cut out of some management decisions. Do you want to talk about any of those experiences?
I think that one of the things that was really great about that opportunity was to have an opportunity to talk to managers, so sort of like the top-down level, and get a sense of, what some of their challenges are, what some of their opportunities are, and how they can affect change, and also hear about what their priorities and needs are. So oftentimes it's, for instance, limited capacity, financial or human, to do what they need to do. And enforcement certainly needs to happen at that level. As in like in fisheries management, enforcement needs to happen from the top down. To a large extent. But then the great thing was also to be able to hear fishers themselves, and so have like very meandering conversations, I would say, with fishers, and find out what their opportunities and challenges are, and to really inform some of the actions that the Pacific community does through conversations with these fishers. So listen to their needs and priorities, and oftentimes realizing that there's a disconnect between what is done at the management level and what are some of the challenges that they face, and how to better bring those two parties together. And I really think that, that was one of the really great experiences that I drew from my time at the Pacific community, is that there's a real effort to do that. So to identify what can be done at the management level, but then what can we really do also to support the communities themselves? What are some of the needs that they identify to support their nutrition security or their sort of financial security as well? Particularly when they're faced with shocks, so climate change or COVID now.
And just to give like a young scientist going into this field, like I'm sure some of the conversations you had with fishery stakeholders have been quite contentious. So what advice or training would you recommend for people who would like to engage in this area, but maybe feeling a bit nervous about having to interact with people who might actually not be very receptive to the advice they have, or might not be keen on working with scientists on some of these topics?
That's a good question. I would say, my advice always is just to be yourself. And so, just to really honor the human side of conversations and to take time and to really come at it in a sort of really humble fashion. I think sometimes there's still very much a sort of approach that we know better because, we have spent time, let's say, in an academic institution. We've learned a lot about fisheries management, so we know the answers, and actually we don't. I think there's always something to learn, and so it's about having a conversation and spending a lot of time listening. and asking questions out of genuine curiosity. And I don't know, I guess, yeah, coming from a really like a heart place rather than a mind space, that's what I've found has been the most helpful and the most real in moving things forward.
Actually, it's come up in a lot of my other conversations too, is being humble and acknowledging that the people you're talking to are experts in their area.
Exactly,
and not being too arrogant about your academic knowledge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I, like in terms of where things have gone really well is exactly that, where just really taking the time. So like in Christmas Island is a good example. So I spent some time in Christmas Island, which is a quite far-flung but the largest atoll in the world that belongs to Kiribati in the Pacific. It's a very remote atoll. And there's a fishery there for the ornamental trade, so for aquarium fisheries. And it was I spent 6 weeks there, and it's very simple living. And it was amazing because I spent all my time basically in the community and working with fishers on boats every single day, and just to really live their experience. And it really gives you such a profound understanding for the barriers that they face. And I think it's so easy to sort of minimize what those barriers look like when you sit in an office and you have all the luxury at your fingertips that we are fortunate to have, and when you don't have that. So like, you know, whatever those barriers might be, sometimes it's not no running water, or, you know, they need to go diving and they have a lot of difficulties to access air or even a vessel or gas to be able to power that vessel. I mean, those are like quite high level sort of barriers, but there's much more to it in terms of livelihood. And so to really live with folks and spend time listening to what their challenges have been gives you a real sense of perspective for, okay, moving forward, what might be some of the solutions that you would want to implement, and to talk to them about, you know, what might that look like? How can we facilitate that and come at it from a very real and tangible way?
Cool. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Good to talk to you. So that was our interview with Colette Wabnitz here on the Vancouver waterfront. So if you're interested to learn more about the vlog, just check out our other posts on YouTube. And if you like this one, please share it with friends and colleagues. And don't forget to give it a star or thumbs up on YouTube as well.